Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Dynamics 365 BCDR and Managed Availability. My name is Stephen Coppins, and I will be your moderator. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Imad Yanni, Principal Product Manager, Chaitali Shah, Principal Software Engineering Manager, and Mike Szymecki, Senior Program Manager. Mike, over to you to get us started.
Okay, great. For the first handful of minutes or so, I'd like to focus on establishing a baseline of common BCDR concepts and terms. I acknowledge that we do post content around this online. I think typically it's high level and sometimes maybe a bit difficult to understand just reading some text and seeing a couple visuals. So in order to establish these concepts during the latter part of our presentation, when we reference those multiple times, we're going to go ahead and understand what's built in by default and also how that is different from our self-service offering, which goes GA tomorrow. Let's start off with this first slide in front of us. BCDR is all about ensuring our organizations and customers can maintain operations during disruptions and recover quickly after the incidents. But what I'd like to do is separate the entire acronym into two distinct concepts. The BC in BCDR stands for business continuity. The focus here is keeping our essential functions running during any kind of disruption. This means that even if we face a natural disaster, a system failure, etc., our critical operations continue without significant interruption. What I look really at this to be is the proactive readiness component of BCDR. On the flip side, disaster recovery is about restoring our systems and data after the incident. It's a plan that we put in place to get our technology back up and running as quickly as possible. I view this as the reactive component that takes place after a disaster actually happens. Those acronyms combine to be BCDR, which is a focus on holistic uptime and recovery for your enterprise dynamics landscape. Now let's set the stage around what our BCDR plumbing covers and what it doesn't. On the left side, you'll notice that we have the events it covers, scenarios such as natural disasters, infrastructure failures, power outages, and things of the like. Pretty straightforward. On the right side, we'll identify what it doesn't cover: cybersecurity threats, human errors, supply chain disruptions, and events of the same nature. These are areas where we all need additional planning and strategies to help mitigate, in addition to what we cover during BCDR. In a nutshell, our BCDR plan is great for handling physical and system-related disruptions, but can't account for everything. We need to be aware of the limitations and prepare accordingly. Now, I'd like to look at a few common terms used within disaster recovery component of BCDR. The first I'll talk to is RPO, or recovery point objective. What this is defined as the maximum time where data might be lost. For example, if a failover is triggered, it represents the history of data that might be lost. The way we quantify this is in minutes, as opposed to something like data volume. In the case of a system outage, RTO, better known as recovery time objective, represents the time taken to get the service and system back up and operational in the new location, whether that's a different data center, region, etc. Finally, another term I'll introduce is replication lag. What this refers to is the delay or the difference between when the data is written to the primary system / region and when it's replicated to the backup system or region. Replication lag in this instance, and when we reference it within the following slides, is really only applicable in the case of asynchronous or cross-geo replication. While there are no specific SLAs for the Dynamics BCDR capabilities, the availability of the service is covered in an umbrella fashion under the SLA Microsoft provides for Dynamics 365 apps. Geo-redundancy, which is something we'll get into later, refers to the capability of having data duplicated in another region in the event of a disaster. When you select the country initially within your tenant, it really sets the stage for everything else. The initial selection is critical because it determines the geographical boundaries and compliance requirements for data residency. Essentially, the country you choose dictates the rules that we need to follow to ensure your data is stored and managed correctly. Next, this country selection filters into what geo or geography is available or assigned. Geos are essentially groupings that define data residency boundaries for compliance, regulatory, and data sovereignty reasons. For example, if you select a country in Europe, your data will fall under the European geo, ensuring compliance with regulations that most of you are familiar with, such as GDPR. Finally, within each geo, we have specific regions assigned. The regions provide more precise physical locations where our data workloads are hosted. For instance, within the European geo, you might have regions like North Europe or West Europe. These regions correspond to specific Azure data centers, ensuring that our data adheres to regional compliance requirements. So again, just to summarize very quickly, country selection of the tenant sets the geographical boundaries. This selection filters into the appropriate geo for compliance and regulatory reasons. And then within each geo, specific regions are assigned to host our data workloads, ensuring regional compliance. In my mind, geo and region have always been somewhat synonymous, and to be honest, somewhat confusing as I look at Microsoft from the outside in. To help commit the differences between geo region and another concept we'll introduce later, availability zones, let's take a look at a couple basic visuals. I'm going to look at the geo of the United States for our example. Notice that Canada is not included purposely because of very distinct regulatory reasons. Within the United States geo, we have two distinct Dynamics regions of East and West US. Not everyone from Missouri is necessarily going to be assigned automatically to East US, but if the customer has a majority of their traffic coming from the East, then it makes sense as a logical choice. If you double click to the East US, the reality is that there are multiple data centers within that region, not just one. A lot of you are probably already aware of this, but what you may or may not have heard of yet is the concept of availability zones. Availability zones, in short, are sets of group data centers where your Dynamics data is automatically replicated synchronously. Data center 1 in the East US goes down, not really an issue. Availability zones are set up so that you seamlessly fail over to a coupled data center. And I wanted to intentionally wait to talk about availability zones as it provides a direct segue into the next segment of our discussion, built-in disaster recovery with availability zones. With that covered, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our colleague Chaitali to walk through the next session of the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. So in this section, we will cover the layers of built-in redundancy to provide customers hyper-availability. Now, as a SaaS offering that is built on Azure, Dynamics 365 and Power Platform have several layers of redundancy. Within a data center, there are fault domains that are isolated portions of the data center such that if one of them fails, we automatically fail over to the other fault domain. Some common failures within a data center are machine or rack failures. We will not be spending much time discussing this because Azure takes care of this for us, and instead we'll focus on the cross data center redundancy or availability zones. So to ensure that the customer's environments are highly available, we have invested in enabling availability zones across our products. There are several reasons why a data center may be impacted, and these could be reasons such as power outages, cooling, or networking loss. There could also be physical damages to the data center that could cause data loss. And this is where availability zones come to the rescue. Built-in DR is based on synchronous replication. Microsoft Power Platform and Dynamics 365 leverage Azure's availability zones for critical resources to provide business continuity and disaster recovery for production-type environments. Please note that this is not applicable for sandbox environments. Now, as I mentioned earlier, availability zones have their own independent power, cooling, and infrastructure, and they're far enough such that an issue that impacts a zone reduces the likelihood of impacting other zones, but at the same time, they're close enough to have extremely low latency connections to other zones. Every region has at least 2 zones, but typically we have 3 availability zones, and each zone has 1 or more data centers within itself. The smaller regions may have a single data center or a zone, but larger regions can have multiple data centers or zones. Now, replication across the zones is synchronous. So if there's any failure in a zone or loss of a zone, the customer traffic will seamlessly and automatically move to the other zones, and the customer would not even notice or see any outage. We manage this entirely on our end, and it is completely transparent to you. For the most part, from the customer perspective, this should really just be a blip. The other thing to note is because the data is replicated synchronously, and anytime there's a failover from one zone to another, you will not, experience any data loss. It's going to be near 0 seconds of data loss. But the RTO could be up to 5 minutes. So here's a real world example of how availability zones have helped us. Back in July 2024, there was a thermal event in UAE that impacted a particular zone. However, none of the critical Dynamics 365 or Power Platform products and services were impacted. We only saw impact to a legacy stack of a service that was already scheduled for decommissioning, our customers were able to benefit from the investments that we've put into enabling availability zones. So with this, I'm going to hand off to Imad, who's going to cover cross region DR or self-service DR.
So Chaitali just went through how your production type environments, where your business applications, whether they are enterprise level CRM applications or just business process and application used in your company, where they are running in production environments, how they are protected through availability zones within a region that we refer to as primary region. And the production environments are the ones where we think need to be protected in terms of redundancy and availability. They are provisioned by the provisioning logic in those primary regions. Now, what happens if the whole region, and that should handle most of the disruptions that happen, but what happens if that all availability zones, because of their proximity within 60 miles, all availability zones are not available for some reason. In that case, there's actually within almost all the geos that are available worldwide, except for a couple that are micro geos, there is actually another Azure region within the geo. Now that Azure region might have availability zones or might not, but that region is available to some customers that want to control failover and availability across a whole geo. So hundreds of miles away to protect themselves and protect their applications, their users, their reputation, etc. In this case, in the case of the cross-region disaster recovery, and when the customer enables it, because this is by default, this is off, and the customer can enable it on a production type environment because this is the environment types that need to be protected. Once the customer enables it, then the data in that environment is replicated asynchronously across the internet to the other region. Meaning that if it's across the internet and anything can happen across the internet, we don't have the dedicated low latency networks, and some data might not make it, some data might be lost. But that is across the geo. If we take an example of a United States or North America as a geo, there is 2 Azure regions within the geo, West US and East US, located in Virginia and California. And one of them will be the primary, where production environments are provisioned. The other one will be secondary. That will be where what we would call a third region. Same thing with let's take in Europe as an example. One of the early geo, the first geo in Europe, Europe geo, with North Europe and West Europe, where one will be the primary with the availability zones and what be the paired region for the self-serve disaster recovery. So let's talk about self-serve disaster recovery. And this is the way we chose to enable this capability, the cross-region disaster recovery, is by empowering the customer to do it on their own. So unlike the within region, in region built-in disaster recovery, where we fail over, we synchronously copy, we fail over. If there's any disruption automatically by ourselves in the service, the customer actually might not know. They don't lose data, and there might be a blip a blip of an outage that the customer may or may not notice. But in the case of across the hundreds of miles, across the geo, and across regions, we chose to do it where we empower the customer to do it themselves, because the simple fact that there might be some data loss, we cannot determine for the customer if that data loss is going to be acceptable. Every customer and every environment might have its own recovery point objective, and we cannot decide if that is 5 minutes or if that is 1 hour. So that's why we chose to implement this as a self-service capability. And the way the customer controls it is in Power Platform Admin Center. It is available to production environments that are managed environments, but also there is a cost associated with it, because the data is replicated synchronously to the other region. All the data is replicated. The capacity that is consumed by the data will be charged to the customer. I'll talk to that in a little bit later. But one of the things that is important here is that in addition to the environment being managed environment, there has to be a pay-as-you-go billing plan associated with the environment or linked to the environment. And the reason is that customer might not know initially how much data, how much capacity will be consumed, and dependent on how many environments they are enabling. And we don't want them to get into the overage situation where they might be impacted. So, for example, they cannot create any more environments. We don't want that to happen. So we want to make sure that the customer has linked a pay-as-you-go plan so that they don't get into that situation. I'll talk a little bit more into detail in further slides. So when the feature is enabled, when it's managed and it's got a pay-as-you-go plan, the data is actively replicated across to the paired region. Now there's a couple of functionalities that are key here. One, of course, is failover if there's a regional outage, and that is up to the customer to do, and I'll walk you through the experience. But another one is the disaster recovery drills. So this is where a lot of customers might need to run drills for purpose of audits or compliance. Some industries require them, some governments require them. And this is the other key capability that the customer can do. The difference is that the disaster recovery drills are what we call planned failover, meaning that there is no data loss. The emergency response would incur, it's what we call unplanned failover, which could incur some data loss represented in time. And the target goal for that is less than 15 minutes. And this is what the customer would usually compare to their RPO. Because this is under the control of the customer, neither the restore time, which we target 5 minutes, nor the replication lag is something that we refer to as the RPO RTO, because this is under the customer's control, compared to the self-serve the built-in disaster recovery with availability zones, because we do that on the behalf of the customer. So we are comfortable saying what is the RPO and what is the RTO. But in this case, it is really the customer is in control. So this feature has been in preview since late January this year, early February. And there's some data from the public preview. We have, and this data is actually a little bit dated. It's about a month old, a few weeks old. We have over 570 tenants that enable this feature in public preview. Over 700 environments within those tenants. 50 of them are large customers, very large customers. And out of these environments, although we did not require the environment to be managed, but out of these environments, over half were managed. So the customer are actually making their environment managed. In the last 30 days, there were 25 of these customers that ran disaster recovery drill, and 15 of the customers that ran emergency responses. Now, this was not due to any disruption. This was not due to any outage. This was due to the customers just running the functionality, whether to test it or whether to actually run a compliance or to test their integration points and document their business continuity plan. So none of these were due to any outages. Now, the data that we collected in terms of the duration it took for the failover or the switch to happen, for disaster recovery drill, the average was 1.09 minutes. The emergency response, which is the unplanned failover, was 1.9 minutes. And when the environment is in the paired region, the customer can switch it back to the prime region. We actually want that to happen because the prime region is the ideal location for a production environment. The average time it took for the customers to switch back was 2.3 minutes. So this is all within the target that we have targeted all this time. As we said, this capability is available to the administrators in the Power Platform Admin Center. So this is the Power Platform Admin Center with its latest design, what we call Green PPAC, that is made of hubs. And one of those hubs, all the way on the left, you can see here, is the Manage Hub. So now I'm in the Manage Hub looking at the environments, and I'm in the environment list view. So if you select a production environment, you can see on top of the screen where the operations are, things like convert, open, copy. You can see that there is a disaster recovery. So if the environment is a production environment, you will see disaster recovery, and you can click on it to open the panel. So once the panel is open, and the environment, at this time, we will know the environment is managed and has pay-as-you-go plan. And if it's managed, then you could be able to turn it on. And the next slide, please. And if the environment does not have a pay-as-you-go plan, you will also see that a pay-as-you-go plan is required. If those two actions the requirements are not fulfilled, then the admin cannot turn on disaster recovery. Now, for the preview customers that are using it, we will not be enforcing manage. So if the customer has turned it on a managed environment, we are not going to enforce that. But if the environment does not have a pay-as-you-go plan, then within 30 days after, they will get a grace period they have been communicated to. And if they don't have a pay-as-you-go plan, then this would be disabled unless they either already have a pay-as-you-go plan or they set up a pay-as-you-go plan, link it to the environment. When the capability is turned on, when the self-service disaster recovery is turned on, there's actually a few resources that need to be set up across the service. Like I said, this capability is not something, is pretty unique in the industry for a customer to be able to take one environment and individually switch it to another region, whether it's in a planned or unplanned manner. So there's a number of resources, and we understand why maybe other companies don't do the same thing. Other services don't do the same thing because it actually takes a lot of the resources to be ready to move it individually. A lot of the other architectures are multi-tenant. And in this case, we do have some aspects of that, but when the customer enables this, we make it where it can be individually failed over to by itself by the customer. So there's some steps that need to happen that need to be initiated by a number of components, which could take some time. So enabling the feature could actually take hours, but the admins will be notified when the environment has been completely enabled. And once disaster recovery, self-service disaster recovery has been enabled, these are the two capabilities that I was talking about that the admin can do, which is they can do disaster recovery drills or can do emergency response. And the difference there is that one is planned, one is unplanned. One will make sure all the data is copied, and the emergency response, which a customer can run at any time, whether there's an outage or not. But in both cases, in any case, we will actually do an unplanned failover, and there might be data loss in terms of time. So in an RPO kind of a calculation. So if I choose emergency response, the top part of the dialog indicates when was the last time the data was replicated successfully. And this is across all the RPs, this is across all the storage types. So database, file, log, lake, everything else. And we do put the most latent of them all. So in this case, this is the time and date when the data was replicated. Then I can look at the time and say, okay, this is acceptable to me or not acceptable to me. So a customer might say, no, this is too long. This is way past my RPO, so I'm going to wait up the outage. Or a customer could say, okay, that was not much loss of data, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over the environment and fit it over to the other region. So they need to copy the name of the environment. We do that in most cases where there might be slight outage. The outage is in minutes, in a couple of minutes, but still, we want the customer to put in the name of the environment before they can continue. And this is modeled, the disaster recovery operation, when it's run, it runs like any other lifecycle operation. We modeled it this way, not only because customers are already used to this pattern, and used to where the locations are, how do they run them, what phases it goes through. And in this case, it will go through these phases until the operation is complete. And as you could see before I showed the data we're getting from public preview, so it could be a matter of a couple of minutes for the environment to completely switch across, in this case, for example, from East US to West US. The reason it's fast is because the replication has been happening all the time. All we're doing really is making sure that all the components are know of the environment, doing what they need to do, and we switch the DNS so that the traffic goes to the other region across the US. But the other reason that we model it as a lifecycle operation is because of internal architecture. Whereas you can imagine, this is a pretty vast platform with many applications, with a lot of resources and a lot of functionality, and we have modeled things that happen at the environment level, operations that happen at the environment level, with all the events, so that all the partners are subscribed to these events or continue to subscribe to events to existing operations or new operations, and can do what they need to do. So if you do a copy, all the other components will need to know that they need to copy whatever they have as components between the environments, the source and target. In this case, they would need to know that a switch has happened, and they need to do what they need to do by subscribing to this environment lifecycle operations. Okay. So when it's complete, you will see a notification, agree notification that it's been complete. And we added another card called disaster recovery in the environment details page. This is the environment details page that will keep you updated with the status of disaster recovery. So for example, when we first turned it on, this card will say that it's been enabled until the environment has been completely enabled. Then it'll say it's ready for disaster recovery. In this case, because I did an emergency response, it is telling me that the environment is in a paired region with limited resources. Now, the environment may or may not have limited resources, but we know it's not in its primary location where the customer has always been using it, and we want to alert the customer that it might be running with limited resources. Because it's an environment lifecycle operation, it'll also behave like other environment lifecycle operations, and it's the operation is recorded in the environment history page. So in this case, you will see what operation had happened at what time. And actually, it's kind of a good place to see how long did it take for the environment to fail over. So as you can see, I did disaster recovery here on April 27 at, what is that, 5:08:04, and it finished at same day, 5:09:56. So it took, less than 2 minutes for the environment to fail over. So yeah, that's another reason why we usually model these operations as ELOs for the customer's sake and for the internal sake. Okay, so what happens if the environment is in the paired region? So you did either disaster recovery drill or you did an emergency response, and you switched the environment from Virginia to California in 2 minutes. So in that case, in the detail in the new card, in the details page, we do tell you this, but also we show an alert in the card in disaster recovery pane that the environment is in paired region and may be running with limited resources, and that is key. That we want the customers to switch it back. Now, this could be. We've seen customers that leave the environment actually in the paired region, possibly for different reasons. One of them could be that they are running tests, because we do suggest that they do the drills and document all the, run their key scenarios, check their data, document all the integration points in their business continuity plans, just in case there is a real outage. But we do recommend for the customers to switch back to the primary region. Now, one of the things that I want to make sure I cover here before I forget is that this is available at this time only for Power Platform environments. So environments that run Power Apps, Power Automate, Dynamics 365, customer engagement, sales, customer service, etc. This is at this time not available to the F&O stack, to the F&O environment and infrastructure. This is something we are still working on. So a customer can select the switch to the primary region and put in the name of the environment and switch it back. And this, as I mentioned, by average, this was around 2.5 minutes for the environment to switch back, because this is same as disaster recovery drills where there is no data loss. So both disaster drills and switching back to the primary region incur no data loss. We make sure that everything is copied before we switch the DNS. So let me talk about billing, since this is a paid feature. If customers want to enable it, the way we chose to do this is through the consumed capacity, because the environment storage is being replicated to a different region. And I'm not going to assume that everybody really understand the details of capacity, but I'll take maybe half a minute or 1 minute to go over it. So when a customer first signs up to Dynamics 365 or Power Apps or some Power Platforms and purchase user licenses, the customer gets some capacity to start with, which we call tenant capacity, as an entitlement. So I believe it was 10 gigabytes of database, some file capacity, and some log capacity. In addition, the customer also gets capacity for every user license they purchase, every enterprise user license, and I believe it's something like 250 megabytes for every user license. So if I bought 4 licenses, let's say Power Apps Premium or Dynamics 365 Sales, I'll get the 10 gigabytes and 250 times 4, so I'll get 11 gigabytes. Now that's my entitled, what we call prepaid capacity. Now I can also, as a customer, purchase additional capacity as an add-on. So I don't have to buy more user licenses or sign up to a different tenant. That wouldn't make sense. I just buy, maybe I need another 10 gigabytes. So I'll buy the add-on of 10 gigabytes of database capacity or file capacity or log capacity. All this is called prepaid capacity. That is an entitlement to the tenant. Now, another model that we rolled out the last couple of years is pay-as-you-go. And pay-as-you-go is the ability for a customer to have a billing plan, an Azure subscription, and say, look, I don't want to purchase all this capacity and have it sitting idle. I want you to bill my subscription based on the capacity I'm consuming every month. So it goes up, goes down. I want my bill to go up or down. I don't want to purchase 50 gigabytes and pay for 50 gigabytes when I may be consuming 10 to start with. So that's another model, pay as you go. Now, the most recent model that is being rolled out is a combination where you could have an environment that is consuming from prepaid capacity. You can even allocate a quota to that environment. So you could say, I have 50 gigabytes, but I don't want this environment to consume any more than 10 gigabytes. So you can control the environment that way, control your capacity consumption that way. But you could also assign a billing plan for the overage. So whether at the tenant level you're reaching above what you paid and you don't want to get into an overage situation, or at the environment level, you reach what you allocated for that environment, and you say anything about that, just charge my billing plan, my Azure subscription. So all these capabilities for capacity are available to this feature, so that the customer has the appropriate capacity billing that they want. Of course, we start with consuming the prepaid capacity, and then it's up to the customer if they want the whole environment to be pay as you go or have a mixed model. And the first thing I want to say, that everything Chaitali said about availability zones, what's built in, is available at no additional cost. So the synchronous replication, the automatic failover for production environments, that's done through availability zones, there is no extra charge for that. So the customers that require cross-region replication, and in addition to the replication and failover, they also want to do unlimited disaster recovery drills, they can enable this capability. Now, the capability is off by default. So in preview, as well as when this reaches general availability on April 30th, environments will be off and the admins will need to turn them on. And when they enable it, when they turn it on, then the customer will incur the capacity charges in the bird region for the capacity that they purchased today, which is the database, file, and log. And it's charged at the same rate at the primary source. It is consumed at the same rate. And if it's pay as you go, it is charged at the same rate. And the experience for the capacity is in the licensing experience. I'm not sure what that looks like in the Power Platform Admin Center. So the experience is not somewhere else. It's in the common experience. And as I mentioned, to prevent the customer from, the reason we require that the pay-as-you-go plan is linked to the environment is to prevent the customer getting into an overage situation and getting into any of the impacts on an overage, capacity overage situation gets them into, for example, not being able to create environments. So we don't want customers to get into that situation, impact themselves, and escalate. So we want to get ahead of that with linking of the pay-as-you-go billing plans. So as I mentioned before, that unless the environment is completely pay-as-you-go, initially the disaster recovery capacity is consumed out of the prepaid capacity. So the tenant entitled capacity that I mentioned earlier, how the customer gets on the customer purchases, but also if they have a mixed model, so they allocated a quota to that environment, and then it reaches above that quota, then the billing to the pay-as-you-go billing plan will start after that, after they reach the quota. And the pay-as-you-go plan is required. So the customer will not be able to turn off the pay-as-you-go plan if a self-serve disaster recovery is turned on environment. They will first have to turn off the disaster recovery feature before they can turn off the pay-as-you-go plan, because we don't want the customer to get into being impacted by the overage situation. Okay, so this is the capacity experience of an environment that does not have disaster recovery activated on it. So this is the new experience. I am now again in the Power Platform Admin Center. I'm in the licensing hub, and I'm in the database page of the licensing hub. So I can see here the summary of what's entitled to me, what's being consumed, but I can go on environment by environment basis and see what is consumed in that environment. So in this case, I have this environment called test 4242. It's in the United States, and now it's consuming capacity. Disaster recovery is not on this environment. Now, if disaster recovery is activated, as you can see under the name of the environment and the region of the environment on top, it says disaster recovery active. So this is how you can tell in the licensing and in the capacity pages that you have an environment that's consuming capacity because disaster recovery. By saying disaster recovery active. The consumed capacity for disaster recovery should also be clear. This is anything that's above that horizontal line up here that could tell you like how much capacity is consumed for disaster recovery. So the primary capacity consumption under the line, disaster recovery above the line, and then the color coding is how the capacity is consumed. So red is actually overage, so the customer wasn't overage for some reason. But purple is the pay-as-you-go. So in this case, customer is wanting to pay pay-as-you-go for disaster recovery. And if that top line was green, then they're consuming from their prepaid capacity and total capacity. There are customers out there that have a ton of capacity available to them. So they never get to the situation where they will not get to a situation, never say never, will not get to a situation where there's pay-as-you-go is not being built. So a customer, an admin, can disable disaster recovery. And the way they disable disaster recovery is by just unchecking the turn on disaster recovery and saying continue. And if they do that, then we will delete all the data in their paired region. And they will not be able to do emergency responses or disaster recovery drills. Of course, they have to put the name of the environment, fill it in, because that will delete the paired region. Now, this has no impact whatsoever to the primary environment. There is no outage, there is no data loss, there is nothing. This is all happening by the service in the paired region. And the customer is not impacted in whatsoever, other than you lose the capabilities of this feature. One of the things that we don't want to get the customer in the situation where if they try to disable the environment when it's in the paired region, because as I said, we don't want the environments to be in the paired regions. That's not the prime region where it should be. So in this case, we don't allow disabling it. So we require that the customer first switch it over. Once the customer selected and they switch to primary region, then after that, and after it failed back, they can disable disaster recovery if they want to do so. Okay, so that was the overview and the description of self-serve disaster recovery feature, the experience in Power Platform Admin Center, the billing experience, and disabling the feature if needed. The way we have been talking about this is that we've been talking about it within the context of managed availability. There was a blog on this in March. Actually, the link here is to the managed availability for Power Platform blog. And this is the way for us to put together the high availability, hyper availability, and the business continuity features together in one package. And right now it is an umbrella term. There is really nothing in the experience right now with this. It's just the blog and the way we are kind of combining these things together in under one umbrella. And they are around the availability zones, so the near zero downtime through the availability zones, the self-serve disaster recovery for the DR drills, and for the which we're calling for compliance here, as well as the emergency response failover in case of an outage, or in case the customer wants to test what happens if they have a data loss, but also automatic backup and point-in-time restore. A lot of our customers think of the capabilities that exist in an environment to do either manual backup at the time of your choosing, or the system backups and the point-in-time restore as a disaster recovery. For example, if their flows get corrupted, then they will go back to a time when the flows were not corrupted. Now, we will continue, so keep an eye out for managed availability. we will continue to invest in this umbrella. So there'll be more to come. We want to make the managed availability story a lot more stronger. So the availability zones and disaster recovery is just a start here. Self-service disaster recovery is just a start. So you might be asking yourself, okay, we understand the experience, we understand the feature. So what does this mean for my environment? And we cannot imagine all the solutions and the complexity in the solutions and the customer's environment and the integration points. But this is the way I would summarize it, is that first, we're building these capabilities for the Power Platform and Power Platform apps, so Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Pages, but also for Dynamics 365 applications. So they're all in scope. And initially, we're starting with the customer engagements. So this is available to sales, customer service, customer insights, etc. FNO is something we are working on. When it comes to running disaster recovery drills or emergency responses, when both regions are healthy, so there's really no region-wide outage, and you run a drill or you run the operation, then customers should not experience any impacts to their end users or to their processes, and things should continue to run. There might be a little blip of an outage while the environment switching over between the regions, but otherwise they should not be experiencing outages. Now, if one of the regions, the prime region, is actually completely out, all the availability zones are out, and there is a region-wide outage, so the customer is actually experiencing an outage, there might be certain functionalities that might continue to experience the impact, and there might be, and many times the engineering team have some manual operations that they need to do on the back end to restore the service. So at this time, there are still some situations of certain functionality that may, when you do this, the self-service disaster recovery switch between regions, and you go to the healthy region, that some functionality might still be impacted. Now, this is the first step, so we're continuing to work on making sure we minimize any disruptions and minimize or reduce or eliminate any need for manual operations. And this is another reason we implemented this as an environment lifecycle operation, so that all the components can continue to deliver to this and make it where similar to the built-in, where when this is run, it actually takes care of all the takes care of any outages that are happening in the system for the customer's environment. So this is just to summarize the built-in aspects, and then on top of that, if the customer wants to also enable self-service, in terms of the redundancy class, one is built-in, one is self-service. Cost model built-in is included, and there's an additional capacity-based cost for self-service. Redundancy for built-in is within region, for self-service across region. The technique for the availability zones for the built-in is availability zones, and for self-service, actually cross-region replication across the internet. Then the replication method is synchronous for built-in and asynchronous for self-service. And as I mentioned, the data loss and the system outage for built-in is the RPO and RTO, and for self-service is verification lag and outage time. So with that, I'll hand it back to the moderators.
Yeah, and just to chime in, sorry, Imad, I was reaching for mute, but was ultimately unsuccessful by the time you started talking. But as Imad said, to me, I feel like this is a good summary slide at the end of the presentation, because it really recaps a lot of the messaging and distills it into kind of one easy to hopefully understand summary. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Stephen.
Now, we have a few minutes, so there's an ongoing, a few questions regarding Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps and where that sits. So I'd just like to reiterate that With built-in or availability zones, Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation apps are covered. It's part of what our customers get when they purchase their license. The current feature, self-service disaster recovery, is focused on CE for this initial release. We are working on Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps, and it will be added to the self-service disaster recovery capability. And we plan on having that available for preview in September of this year, at which point we will be providing more information about what's covered. At this point, we will definitely focus on the core capabilities of finance and operations, and then build it out. Imad, do you have anything to add on Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps and self-service disaster recovery?
Yeah, no, I was just responding to the question. So yeah, at this time, finance and operation is not supported for self-service disaster recovery, meaning that Power Platform environments that are linked to finance and operation in Power Platform will not see the disaster recovery functionality. So they cannot turn on at this time.
Thank you. And there's one more question which is just popped up, which is my understanding currently that cross-region is automatically on. So once this feature is released, will that be turned off?
For the environments, if I know that this feature is not available, they are on. But where this feature is available, they are not on. So they are replicated between availability zones, but another cross region, because this capability is out there.
Thank you. Thanks to our presenters and to you, our audience, for attending our Tech Talk today. We hope you have a great rest of the day ahead. Thank you very much.